Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Rojas, and I am a senior at St. Leo University. The presentation I'm going to give to you today is called Chicanos in the United States. This presentation is a result of a year's worth full of work, first beginning as a histography and then transforming into a more focused topic. Um, so, a quick explanation as to why I chose this topic. I myself am a Latino American, with my mom coming from Peru and my dad from Puerto Rico. And I wanted to pick a topic that I could relate to in a sense. I wanted to pick a topic that I can look back into the past and see how my heritage has transformed in order to understand why and where it was at the present. So let's take a look back at my historiography. So my historiography began with the Zoot Suit riots and the Sleepy Lagoon trials. Um, I wanted to focus on these two events because I wanted to see the organizations and the political leaders and the ideologies that developed out of them. A quick background of these events is the Sleepy Lagoon trials was a trial of 18 individuals who were known as the 78th Street Gang. They were convicted of murder, but there was very little evidence to actually pin them down to that murder. So a lot of historians and a lot of individuals during the time believed that this trial was racially motivated. Um, this began a lot of the tensions of Latino Americans and Mexican Americans tension in the Los Angeles area. This tension was only built upon when U.S. soldiers began going into Mexican American communities in Los Angeles and hitting on the women of Mexican American men. Um, this would result in fights, and those fights would turn into some brawls that would go into the streets, and eventually resulted in about 3 or 4 days of nothing but fighting in the streets. This eventually led to people outside of the Los Angeles area and even out of the state coming into the Los Angeles area and fighting against Mexican Americans, a lot of them being white supremacists and white conservatives. So the sources that I had. Jessica Vasquez, Mexican Americans Across Generation, Immigrant Families, and Racial Realities. This provided a first person perspective for individuals who were at the Zoot Suit riots or participated in the Zoot Suit riots. Both Kevin Hillstorm and Obregon Eduardo Pagan's books provided the insight of how the Zoot Suit riots began, how they ended, and then their influence. They both touch on to the Sleepy Lagoon trials, and how that was the beginning of what would eventually become the Zoot Suit riots. So, what did I find? So, in terms of organizations, I found that Committee for the Defense of Mexican American Youth, Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee, and the Coordinating Council for Latin American Youth. These were committees that were developed during the Sleepy Lagoon or slightly afterwards. They were there to help fund the legal procedures of the individuals, and a little bit later, they would help more people with legal troubles. But eventually, these committees would go out of action, no longer being used, and a lot of them are no longer used today because they simply just don't have the funding. The Los Angeles Committee for American Unity, though, is actually still active. It's not as prominent as it once was, but it is still there. The political leaders that came out of it. So we have Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was not involved in the Zoot Suit riots. He did not participate in the Zoot Suit riots, but the influence that the Zoot Suit riots had on Cesar Chavez is what he says inspired him, or not just him, a lot of Latino Americans and Mexican Americans during the labor fights and the labor rights protests that he led. Guadalupe Cordero and Manuel Ruiz were both individuals who were part of the groups that began the Mexican American and Latino American organizations that were there to provide legal help for Mexican or Latino Americans who were unjustly charged. the ideologies that developed. So you had Chicano or Chicanoism and the Basquas. Chicanoism was more for men, the Basquas for women. Both represented just heritage and um, being yourself. So where did I take this? So I wanted to focus more on Chicanoism. Although Chicanoism did begin for mostly men, it then eventually transformed into a broader representations that would include women. I wanted to see how Chicanoism changed, why it changed, and what was the current state of it. Um, so I used a lot of primary sources for this research. One individual who was huge was Luis Valdez. He was a playwright and he was an activist in the 70s and 60s. He was a proud Chicano. They called his theater the Chicano Theater. One of his biggest achievements and one thing that really helped me in my research was the Zoot Suit play that he developed back in the 70s. The Zoot Suits was basically a play that talked about the Sleepy Lagoon and the Zoot Suits and what conspired, and Luis Valdez gave his twist on the idea of the Chicano ideology that developed out of it. I also use clippings from the New York Times that both gave an account of the increased interest of Chicano in the mainstream media. It showed the individuals that supported, like Cesar Chavez, um, who was a huge advocate for Luis Valdez's play, his multiple plays, and also provided like the reviews of what people were saying were an amazing play. So it showed me and it gave an insight about how individuals were seeing uh, a person who is such a Chicano in the mainstream media. I also use Jose R. Ferrigo's writings. He was a Latin American who wrote about his experience in the United States, and a lot of it encompassed Chicanoism. I did use other sources. I go back to Mexican Americans across generations, immigrant families, and racial realities because it gives like real counts of families in various generations. So I'm able to see how Chicanoism developed throughout the years. Um, I used World War II Mexican American civil rights. It gave me a glimpse of why Mexican Americans struggled with recognition. So, like, one of the main reasons why Chicanoism even developed. And then I used Chicano politics, the realities and promise 1940s to 1990s. This gave an analytical breakdown of the shift that happened throughout the years. So it provides a reason as to how politics and Chicanoism both corresponded and were related to one another and influence one another. So the end result. So what did I find at the end of all this? So in the 40s and 50s, we see a bunch of Mexican Americans have this feeling of assimilation. And a lot of them felt like they no longer had a heritage that they could call their own. They were just American. And a lot of them didn't want to just be American. So you see Chicanoism be more or so about gaining your own identity and developing your own self within your community. So that's why you see a lot of these individuals have these zoot suits, these pointy shoulders, because it gave them an identity that they felt like they never were able to have. And this is mostly encompassed of first generation Mexican Americans. So then we go into the 60s and 70s where we first see the shift in the ideals of Mexican Americans in Chicanoism. So in the 60s and 70s, there is a return of roots sense. There are individuals like Luis Valdez and Cesar Chavez who are now leading the forefront of Chicanoism, and they stress the importance of understanding your past and not allowing to be assimilated, and how it's important for one to look back into the roots. Um, so you see a huge emphasis on heritage, not American heritage, but Mexican heritage. Um, and that begins to change again in the 80s and 90s. The 80s and 90s, you now have a bunch of individuals who are a bunch of Mexican Americans and Latino Americans who are now becoming U.S. citizens. They're leaving their enclaves, they're going to school, they're becoming educated, and they're beginning to see ways in which they can help their community in more ways than just protests or grassroots movements. One of the main ways, or one of the main tools that they find is voting, voting for your representation, your representatives. So you see a lot of Mexican Americans become political. And this is where Chicanoism comes into play. Chicanoism begins to turn into more or so of what type of political sphere are you connected to? Are you a more conservative Chicanoism, or are you a more liberal Chicano? So that's where Chicanoism and politics begin to play with one another. And that leads into the present, where Chicanoism is almost no longer relevant because a lot of Mexican Americans, Latino Americans, are now, instead of corresponding with Chicanoism, they're corresponding more with their political party that they're aligned. So they're either Democrats or they're Republicans. Um, but we see some pushback in this, where you have Luis Valdez, who was gone during the 80s and 90s, now begin to develop more plays, revamp more plays, especially the Zoot Suits, where he is now playing in a bunch of theaters across the United States to help revitalize this idea of Chicanoism being about heritage rather than politics. So that is my presentation. I hope I was able to give everybody a better insight of Chicanos throughout the United States.